Our next speaker, Beka Economopolous, is she is a organizer with Occupy Wall Street and a senior strategist with Fish and Strategy and a old friend of PDF, I should add. Spoken before at one of our conferences. I can't remember which one. You don't either. And Beka has been deeply involved in a lot of the work that's happened here in New York since Occupy began. And so I'm very much thrilled that she's here joining us. Is it true you haven't had dinner, a normal evening dinner, in 3 months? Almost. So she's been very, very hard at work, and it's a privilege to have her here to describe what's been going on. Beka.
Great. Thanks, Mika. What I wanted to do is jump on the bandwagon a little bit and talk about the merits of network-focused organizing versus more traditional advocacy models or politics as usual that focus exclusively on organizations or coalitions. And deconstruct a little bit what I think makes Occupy and the Tea Party successful. But I'd also like to weave in a few cautionary notes around the evangelism of leaderless or exclusively kind of process-focused or tools-focused organizing, and plus an evangelism of form and means at the expense of ends. So I'll just start with talking about network organizing. Now, I have a background as a professional organizer, working for years with organizations, but also having some movement organizing experience. I was involved in what I call the alter globalization movement. Anti-globalization was really a misnomer. And something that I think is very different, that organizations are very well equipped to activate their constituencies, right? And usually, more often than not, that's around single issue politics or a platform, a range of issues. Whereas I think movement organizing that is effective or successful in taking off is often more systemically focused rather than issue focused, in that it also really speaks to network theory insofar as it's about activating nodes of influence. And that is a very, very different model than blasting your email list to turn folks out, or making calls on your conference call with coalition so that you can collectively turn out numbers for a particular day, and that's it. What that doesn't set you up for is this self-propelled organizing that happens on the part of unaffiliated individuals. So people who feel deeply motivated and empowered to be able to form their own networks, right? And that also nodes of influence are activating, their own constituencies. Those are their spheres of influence, their friends, their colleagues, people who are aligned around particular affinities and interests. So to me, that's what network-focused organizing looks like. And good old-fashioned organizing principles tell us that that would be more effective. What you were speaking to, which is the difference, I think, between community organizing and just advocacy-focused organizing, where it's more deeply entrenched in community, in lived experience. And also, we know this not just from organizing principles, but from lessons from the advertising and persuasion industries. And that is that it's not the case that one size fits all, one message fits all. Madison Avenue will tell you, you have a target audience, and you develop a vocabulary around that particular audience. They have different goals and interests from another one, right? That's the same thing you learn as a canvasser knocking on doors, right? Is that it's not one rap fits all, right? That ultimately when you show up, it's human to human, person to person, talking about, hey, what do you care about? What are you passionate about? What upsets you? What motivates you? And how does that connect to the reason why I'm at the door? So I think that's a really important thing as we're thinking about building movements is to recognize that people are motivated by self-interest, not altruism, right? Altruism is the organization model, where I would argue it's a very kind of liberal model of we'll help you. Versus if you're framing things in a more systemic way, then it's understanding how your self-interest is connected to someone else's, and you're building much deeper alliances. It's coming from kind of a deeper place. That also, I think back to the 2006 immigrant rights movement, when there were they caught fire across the country, started off in Los Angeles, about 1 million people turned out. The media and my colleagues within the online organizing and technology fields were really excited about the role that MySpace was playing in turning folks out. And I think that's valid and valuable, but I really see it as a blended model, right? So one, it's laying the groundwork and the foundation for people to be networked through social networks, so that when there are these catalytic moments, you can fan the flames and it takes off organically. However, what organizations do bring to the picture is resources, infrastructure, and scale. So I think it would be remiss to walk away from this panel and not think that organizations and infrastructure actually play a very significant role that is a hybrid model of bottom-up and top-down, and that we think about it, at least in Occupy Wall Street and other movements, I would suggest, as alliances or solidarity rather than coalitions. And that's also really, really important from the perspective or vantage of Occupy Wall Street, right? And I'm sure the Tea Party hears this, and Occupy Wall Street hears this. On our end, it's Soros, the labor unions, et cetera. That's who's running the show. I would argue that that's absolutely not the case. However, there are times where our interests converge, and that's when we're going to do joint turnout. Or, for instance, when there was the threat of eviction because Bloomberg and the city wanted to clean Zuccotti Park, and many of us read that as we want to dismantle the encampment permanently. That was a time where folks kicked into gear, did a lot of local organizing in Zuccotti and leveraging our various online properties in order to activate our networks, but also putting in phone calls to friends within organizations who can phone bank 10,000 people that night, or send out to their lists giant lists, emails saying, hey, show up at 6 in the morning. So there's these points of convergence that make sense, but at the same time, really wanting to resist co-optation, because this is not a political movement insofar as it's electorally focused. And that's where I would, I'll hold on that point. So I think community is a really, really important piece, because that's where it gets deep, and it's values-based. And what the left hasn't had is a relationship to faith-based organizations in a really deep way that are doing that day-to-day sustained community building and organizing and touching people's hearts and fulfilling their needs, right? And I think that that's something that actually the public spatial occupations has really contributed to, is actually a place where, we have a soup kitchen, so to speak. The homeless can show up. Like the most marginalized of our society can find resources and community in that place. And space is a really important kind of organizing principle in many ways of Occupy Wall Street, I think, or the Occupy movement in general. One is it provides a destination for a point of entree for absolutely anyone, right? So it's a challenging movement, or movements in general can be challenging to plug into, but at least no matter what, you could show up at a place and you can meet folks and you could kind of learn the lay of the land or participate in a general assembly. I would question a little bit the General Assembly equals the tweet size operationalizing of the tools and so on. I mean, I think in some ways the General Assembly and Zuccotti Park is, one, putting on stage defiance and sacrifice, which captures people's imaginations. And that is something that also is kind of central to historical social movements that we see right now. But two, there is a bit of political theater. Like, it is staging activism, it is staging participation, it is staging democracy, and you know, kind of a social experiment as counterposed to more closed systems behind, you know, behind closed doors, politics as usual, right? Is it idealistic? Of course, yeah. Is it scalable? Perhaps not. But I think it's an important point of entree for folks as they're entering into, for so many people, activism for the first time. So I think, you know, the tools absolutely help with decentralization. There's no bottleneck. We've given people the tools for publishing and promoting, and that allows for and enables rapid response. Currently, I'm working on one initiative that involves engaging arts and culture communities, and just found out last night as we were helping to develop Occupy Art NYC.org that there is Occupy musicians, Occupy writers, Occupy filmmakers, Occupy comics, and OccupyDesign.com. And you know, and you go to each site, and there's a long list of signatories and folks who are kind of self-organizing within that framework, which I think is kind of amazing, which speaks to another point I wanted to make, which is about the open source brand, right? So I think that that's kind of an important understanding of what's going on here, is that that the brand Occupy Wall Street or Tea Party, et cetera, is contested. Nobody controls that. And that, I love that you said a whole bunch of people showed up with handwritten signs. And I mean, one thing that signals is it's coming from lots of different places. And we can manufacture that, and folks have, you know, front groups, et cetera. But it's really authentic in this case. So the idea of the contested name, it's not owned or determined by any kind of hierarchical force, or is it perceived necessarily to be horizontal or equal. It is actually actively contested. It is a battleground. And that is one thing that I would suggest, actually, this notion of occupation, of occupying a name, a symbol, a story, et cetera, is something to think about, and that I think the Tea Party has actually done very well, excavating, interpreting, and claiming American history, understanding that history is not a thing of the past, it's of the present and of the future. So there's an active contestation going on. So Occupy is that as well. There are different definitions of what it is. Occupying something and giving it meaning transforms the landscape of occupying different positions within that landscape. So I think finally what I want to say is that that said, while it's a struggle, you know, it's disingenuous to suggest that this all happens online and that it's all leaderless, right? I think one thing that the Occupy Wall Street movement has done effectively is get people for the first time in a long time out of their houses and off their computers. We're moving beyond clicktivism. So, you know, it started out as an occupation of like 50 people, but that really inspired folks, like putting their bodies on the line, doing something courageous, critiquing, you know, at this point, this generation, I heard something, a statistic that suggested that the young generation now has seen the apocalypse in film and popular culture more so than any other, right? We kind of live in a post-apocalyptic movement, and there is not a whole lot of hope out there. If you're a young person and you're trying to get into college and you're saddled with debt, or you've just graduated from college and you're saddled with debt and you live at home with your parents, 60% of college students now live at home with their parents and don't have jobs, right? Every institution has failed them. And, you know, we've tried electoral avenues, but I think it's obvious that There's no easy solutions that are apparent in that way. So I think, movement politics is really the only answer right now. But the focus on the process, the tools, network democracy as a conversation at the expense of defining the ends, I want to problematize a little bit. And that's that, the Occupy movement is a critique of neoliberalism. The last 40 years of an agenda of privatization, deregulation, financialization, in other words, the concentration of wealth, right, and the the financialization internationally, and corporate-driven globalization, right? It is an international movement, so we are not calling for easy reforms. Both parties are the problem. Our political process is poisoned by the influence of money. This is an international movement from Egypt to Tunisia to Greece to Italy to Spain and the UK. These are all popular uprisings like ours in response to the economic crisis, the cutting of social safety nets, budget cuts, and privatization. Our economic system is broken, and we're going to settle for nothing less than fundamental and structural change, right? And so it's a misunderstanding of power and how power functions in the contemporary age if the solution is an unalloyed faith in decentralization, right? And because at this point, I would argue that power no longer emanates from a centralized closed authority, as it perhaps did decades ago, that now it's been invisibilized and extended. And so our prongs of attack of presenting solutions need to respond to that as well. I want to speak to this go versus no, because I feel like to a degree it represents a misunderstanding of a social movement versus a political or electoral movement. What I see happening with Occupy, there's a lot of criticisms of what are your demands, why don't you get into running folks in primaries, et cetera, it depends on how you're defining the problem, right? Occupy came to be as a movement inspired by other uprisings this year and recognizing and understanding a connection to them, that there is a common denominator. And that also because of a time of crisis, actually the tactic of occupation, there was a new school occupation 3 years ago, and it spread to NYU and then to the West Coast and was very successful in California. There was an occupation of a factory by labor in Chicago. There's networks of folks that have been working in activist ways that are outside of institutions, for a long time. But I think the thing is, it kind of catches fire now because of crisis. And if you define the problem, I'm going to say the word capitalism, an ideology of the cancer cell, unlimited growth in a finite system, leads to the concentration of wealth. So I would challenge the notion that elections are scheduled insurrections, and that Egypt is a failure because it hasn't succeeded in pushing elections forward in this moment. There's a lot of activists on the ground. There's another revolution in Egypt right now by people who don't want to see the same regime in a different face, beholden to the same interests installed right now, right? So elections are not insurrections if you're not actually changing the rules of the game. Right, and changing the rules of the game is not just like a third party, right? It's the influence of money in politics. And what's next? I mean, I think a social movement functions to tilt the political playing field, to change the conversation, to shift the terms of the game. And then, groups with pointy-ended campaigns and very specific demands find that they gain new traction against a new backdrop.
Right.
So speaking to the focus on process or network democracy without the other piece of the puzzle, to me it's a conflation of form and content, means and ends, and that misses the point of Occupy Wall Street or this social movement, and really of most social movements. One, to speak to, it invisibilizes power, right? The General Assemblies, I'd like to see them everywhere. They should multiply. We should bring more people into the conversation, absolutely, and invigorate our democracy. But at the same time, it does, that's the tyranny of structuralistness. It does privilege certain voices, and it does mean that decisions get made outside of those forums, and that's invisible. And it's the illusion of democracy, which I think is the status quo, and the problem right now is that we have the illusion of democracy, and when in actuality our politicians are bought and paid, and bought and sold or paid for, or whatever, and the influence of money in politics and of lobbyists and of Wall Street, and this whole stop and go thing, and what are you guys going to do? It's not focused. It's called Occupy Wall Street for a reason. There is a focus on a critique of our economic system and the influence of money and financialization internationally. And so I think that we have to, at this point, think about the 99% versus the 1%. It's in the frame right there, and that it's not about short-term demands. It's about expanding the political imagination.
Great, thank you.